The fluorescent lights hummed their flat, endless song above Sacred Heart ER. Elena Martinez moved through the space with the kind of invisibility that comes from years of learning to disappear. Her shift started at 6 in the morning, same as always, same triage station, same rhythm, assess, prioritize, move. Her left leg favored slightly as she walked, a reminder that some injuries never quite heal, just learn to whisper instead of scream. Reading glasses hung from a chain around her neck. Grey threaded through her dark hair at the temples. Mid-40s, efficient, forgettable. Just another nurse pushing through another shift at a hospital that never stopped breaking people and asking them to heal. He didn't see what lived in her hands. The paramedics wheeled in a John Doe at 6:22 a.m. Male, mid-30s, unconscious from a downtown alley collapse, no wallet, no identification, smelling of 3 days unwashed and something else, the particular smell of someone living in their car. He wore a faded tactical jacket over a ripped t-shirt, and the paramedics' note said they'd found him behind a vacant strip mall on 3rd Avenue. No witnesses. No emergency contact. Just another body the city had spit back out. Elena was assigning him to Bay 3 when her eyes caught the shoulder. The tattoo was small, weathered by sun and time, but unmistakable. A Ranger tab, 2 curved lines forming a scroll with letters Elena had learned to recognize in a field hospital outside Bagram where men bled out faster than she could stitch them back together. She'd seen that tattoo hundreds of times. On platoon leaders. On squad mates. On the shoulders of 18-year-olds who looked 30 because they'd learned too much too fast. Her hand stilled on the gurney rail. The John Doe's eyes remained shut. His breathing shallow and irregular. But the tattoo on his left shoulder was unmistakable, and when Elena cut away his tactical jacket to assess injuries, she saw the marks that matched her training, the body of a soldier, scars telling their own story. Knife wound on the ribs. Surgical scar on the left side of his abdomen, old enough to have faded to white. Contusions on his knuckles that suggested he'd fought hard before he fell. Run him for internal bleeding, she said to the resident, her voice level, her hands already moving on their own. Muscle memory. Field medicine remembered through muscle and bone, the way bodies remember trauma even when minds try to forget. Get a CT chest. Full trauma panel. Type and cross 6 units. The resident glanced at her. Insurance. Unknown. Run it anyway. She was cutting away the rest of his shirt when she saw it. The tattoo. Not just the Ranger tab, she'd already identified him by that, but the way the ink sat on his shoulder, the specific angle of the scroll, the tiny flaw in the lower curve where the tattoo gun had caught wrong. She knew this tattoo. She'd seen it on the shoulder of a captain, 3 tours back, a man who'd sent her careful emails about her son after the boy had enlisted without telling her first. Captain Derek Chen. Her hands went still for exactly 2 seconds. Then they moved again, assessing, checking, the professional detachment sliding back into place like armor. No tremor. No gasp. Just the smooth continuation of work. But her eyes were taking in details now, filing them away, the way a combat medic files away survival information. She found his jacket on the gurney rail. The tactical vest was useless, mud-stained and torn, but the jacket underneath was different. Better made. The kind of piece a soldier keeps from before, from when there was uniform and structure and names instead of numbers. Elena slid her fingers along the inner lining, feeling the texture of fabric, looking for what soldiers always carried. What they always wanted found. There. Sewn into the jacket lining with careful stitches was a patch. Faded. The kind that had lived against skin for years, covered by layers, protected like a prayer. It was small, maybe 3 inches across, with the distinctive crossed rifles and tab design of the 75th Ranger Regiment. Unit designation. A piece of identity that someone had preserved like a talisman, like proof they'd been something once. Elena's phone was in her scrub pocket. The hospital had installed the new network system 3 weeks ago, and everything had to be documented now, photographed, logged. Every patient, every item of value, every piece of evidence that might prove important later. She'd hated it at first, the constant recording, the documentation, but old habits die hard, and field medicine had taught her that you never know what information becomes critical until you already need it. She photographed the tattoo first. Clean angle, good light from the bays overhead. The Ranger tab sharp and clear. Then she carefully lifted the jacket, angled it to catch the fluorescent lights, and photographed the patch. The stitches. The faded colors. The careful preservation of identity that someone had sewn into the lining like a secret. Her hands were steady. They always were. That was what 15 years of field medicine taught you, hands could learn to be steady even when everything inside was collapsing. She could feel the pressure in her chest, the sudden reality that Captain Derek Chen, her son's commanding officer, the man who'd protected her boy in a place she couldn't reach, was lying on a trauma gurney with no identification, no wallet, no name. The photos were clear. Timestamp, 6:52 a.m. All the documentation. All the proof of identity preserved in 2 images on her hospital phone. She was sliding the phone back into her scrub pocket when she felt the presence behind her. Not movement. Not sound. Just the sudden shift in air pressure, the way a room changes when someone with weight enters it. Elena had learned to read these changes the way sailors read water. She turned, keeping her expression neutral, her face the familiar mask of the anonymous nurse in a hospital that never asked questions. Dr. Ashford stood in the bay doorway, his arms crossed, his eyes narrowed as they studied her. Studying her hands. Studying the photograph gesture she'd just completed. Studying the unusual attention she was paying to a homeless-looking John Doe who'd been brought in from an alley with nothing but rags and a tactical jacket. Spending a lot of time on that one, Ashford said. His voice carried the particular tone of a man used to being listened to, accustomed to authority sitting in his throat like something native. He was tall, silver-haired, the kind of expensive that came from old money, tailored coat, watch that probably cost more than Elena's monthly rent, shoes that had been polished this morning by someone other than himself. What's the insurance status? Unknown, Elena said. Her voice was quiet. Professional. The voice of someone who'd learned that volume was a choice, and power lived in the spaces between words. No identification. No emergency contact information. Ashford's eyes moved from her face to the John Doe's unconscious form, then back again. Something shifted in his expression. A calculation. The kind of assessment doctors made when deciding how much effort a life was worth. Run the standard panel. If he codes and he can't pay, he goes to county. We're at capacity, Martinez. Don't waste resources on someone who can't cover the cost. He's a trauma patient. Standard protocol. Standard protocol assumes someone worth saving has someone willing to pay for the saving. Ashford uncrossed his arms. His movement was casual, dismissive, the kind of body language that said the conversation was finished, the decision already made. He was already turning away, already moving on, but something in his eyes lingered on her for a fraction of a second. A curiosity. A suspicion. The look of a man who'd noticed something slightly off in the way she'd moved, the way she'd photographed the patient's belongings like they mattered. Then he was gone, his footsteps receding down the corridor, and Elena was alone with a John Doe who was actually Captain Derek Chen, and a phone in her pocket that held proof of an identity no one was supposed to find. She turned back to her patient. The monitors beeped their steady rhythm. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical breath. The IV drip hung suspended above the bed, gravity doing its work, delivering fluid to a body that had decided, for reasons no one knew yet, that the streets were safer than whatever had come before. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the calculation she could feel forming in the back of her mind, the one that came from 15 years of combat medicine and the knowledge that when you recognized someone in a place they weren't supposed to be, there were always consequences. People didn't end up in downtown alleys 3 years after you'd last heard their names unless something had broken. Unless they'd run. Unless they were hiding. And if Captain Derek Chen was hiding, he'd had reasons. Elena pulled the bay curtain closed, creating a small island of privacy in a hospital designed for exposure. She checked his vitals again. Heart rate elevated but stable. Oxygen saturation acceptable. No immediate signs of internal bleeding, but she'd pushed the CT scan so they'd know soon enough. She'd ordered the blood work that would tell them if he'd been using, if he'd been sick, if he'd been slowly dying before the alley finished the job. She picked up the tactical jacket again, feeling the weight of it, the history. Soldiers kept their gear like other people kept photos. This jacket had been with this man through things Elena understood at the cellular level. The kind of things that changed you. The kind of things you carried in fabric and memory because you couldn't put them anywhere else. She carefully folded it, placed it on the side table, and went to check on her other patients, moving through the ER with her familiar invisibility, her hand steady, her expression neutral, the photograph of a ranger tab and a sewn-in patch burning in her pocket like something that wanted to be found. The hallway outside Trauma Bay 3 smelled like antiseptic and industrial coffee. Elena was checking the 4 line on her post-op patient when Dr. Ashford's voice cut through the steady hum of monitors. Nurse Martinez. A word. Not a request. The way he said it made 2 residents and a medical student turn their heads. They were reviewing charts at the workstation, and now all 4 sets of eyes tracked her as she stepped into the corridor, her shoes clicking against linoleum that suddenly felt very loud. Ashford positioned himself between her and the exit. His tie was silk, expensive, the kind that whispered money in a room that ran on minimum wage and overtime. Can you explain why you took unauthorized photographs of a patient without consent or medical justification? His voice carried down the corridor like a public announcement. A nurse passing with a medication cart slowed her pace. Listening. Elena's hands remained steady. Her voice came out low, measured. He had a ranger tab tattoo. Unit patch sewn inside his jacket. She kept her eyes level with his. I was trying to identify him. For his family. So you're admitting you violated HIPAA because of a personal connection? Ashford smiled, thin, surgical, the kind of smile a knife would make if it could grin. That's exactly the kind of emotional compromise that makes you a liability, Nightingale. The nickname landed like a slap across her face, diminishing, infantilizing. He'd been calling her that since the shift began, a deliberate mockery of her service record that only she understood. The residents exchanged glances. One of them, the tall one with the Stanford pin, was already typing something into his phone. Elena took one measured breath. The fluorescent light above them buzzed in a frequency that only seemed to exist in hospitals at 3 a.m. One tear escaped her left eye. Just one. She didn't blink it away. She wiped it without breaking eye contact, her jaw tight enough to cut glass. Captain Chen deserves someone who recognizes what he's sacrificed. I'll stay until he's stable. Ashford's jaw tightened. He opened his mouth, closed it. The moment stretched like a rubber band pulled too far. Then he turned and walked back toward the nurse's station, his footsteps sharp against the tile. Within the hour, Elena found her name on the assignment board circled in red marker. Night shift. Starting tomorrow. No explanation. No conversation. Just a schedule changed like she'd been erased from the daytime world and reassigned to the darkness where nobody had to see her. The next morning, she sat down at the communal table in the break room with her coffee. 3 nurses were already there, Sarah from ICU, Marcus from the day shift, and Jennifer, the charge nurse who'd trained Elena 6 years ago. The conversation stopped like someone had hit mute. Sarah stood first. Then Marcus. Then Jennifer, her coffee cup still steaming on the table, a small betrayal in the gesture. Their footsteps echoed in the sudden quiet. Elena sat alone, the cup in her hands growing cold, watching the steam rise and disappear like it had never existed at all. She didn't move for 5 minutes. She sat there and drank her coffee. Ate her yogurt. Checked her phone. Every gesture was deliberate, mechanical, a performance of normalcy for the security camera in the corner. When she walked back to the unit, her limp was slightly more pronounced. The old shrapnel injury in her left hip always ached when she was tired, and she hadn't slept since yesterday morning. The unit board near the nurse's station displayed a new notice in Dr. Ashford's precise handwriting, Reminder: unauthorized patient photography is grounds for immediate suspension. All staff must maintain professional boundaries. See Elena Martinez file for cautionary example. Two families waiting for patient update stared at her as she passed. One woman pulled her phone out, started recording. Elena kept moving, her expression blank as a slate. By evening, Elena overheard Ashford outside the supply room on his phone, his voice low but carrying. Yes, I need you to flag her credentialing file, emotional instability, unauthorized contact with a patient she claims to know. I'm documenting everything. She stood frozen, her hands full of sterile gauze packages, listening to him dismantle her reputation one adjective at a time. When he turned a corner and saw her standing there, he smiled. You're still here. I thought you'd be ashamed to show your face. She set the gauze down on a cart and walked past him without responding. That was the only weapon she had left, her silence, her composure, the refusal to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. Her reassigned night shift began at 10 p.m. The ER at night felt like a different planet, quieter, more desperate, the kind of place where people arrived in pieces and you had to decide which piece mattered most. Elena moved through her assigned patients with mechanical efficiency. Sprained ankle. Possible appendicitis. Diabetic who'd missed 3 days of insulin. She did her job. She did it well. And she waited. At hour 28, she checked on Chen despite Ashford's restrictions. His vitals were holding, but his left lung sounded diminished when she placed her stethoscope against his ribs. The breath sounds were shallow, irregular. She noted it in his chart and paged the on-call resident. Dr. Patterson called back 15 minutes later. It's probably just the ventilator position. Don't worry about it. He didn't examine the patient. He didn't come to the unit. He hung up and Elena listened to the dial tone like it was a door slamming. By hour 32, she tried to access Chen's full chart to add her assessment and was blocked. Her credentials had been downgraded, view only. No documentation privileges. She approached Jennifer, the charge nurse who'd sat down and left her alone in the break room. Dr. Ashford left instructions. You're not primary on this patient anymore. Jennifer wouldn't meet her eyes. The words hung there like a curse. Elena's hands gripped her tablet so hard her knuckles went white. She made 3 attempts to reach her son by phone. He was on training exercises somewhere north of Camp Lezon, unreachable, his phone left at the barracks like a professional soldier would do. She wanted to tell him about Chen. About where his commanding officer was. About whether he was going to survive. She couldn't. The silence felt like a conspiracy against her. At hour 34, Ashford appeared for an unusual night rounds check. He positioned himself outside Chen's room like a sentient threat. Nurse Martinez, I've been reviewing your pattern of behavior. You're spending excessive time with a patient you're not assigned to. It suggests obsessive tendencies. He pulled her into a corner near the medication dispensary. His voice dropped to a level where only she could hear him, but his eyes stayed level, challenging. You're too emotionally compromised to work trauma. I'm recommending you transfer to outpatient. Or take a medical leave. Elena's hands gripped her tablet. She took one measured breath. Her voice came out steady, almost conversational. I'm exactly where I need to be. The transformation in her voice was subtle but unmistakable, no pleas, no apology, no deference. Just a statement of fact delivered like a command. Ashford's face tightened. He turned away from her and made a call from the hallway. He's back to the unit. Administration? We may have a patient safety issue developing. I need to report concerning behavior in one of my nurses. Obsessive patterns, emotional instability, potential for patient stalking. Yes, I'm documenting. I'll have the file ready by morning. Elena returned to her patients. She checked vitals. She changed for fluids. She moved like a ghost through the hallway, and around her the hospital continued its work, indifferent to the destruction happening in slow motion at the edges. Nobody moved to help her. Nobody stood up. Nobody said a word. At hour 36, the monitor alarms began shrieking, not the gentle warning beep, but the full code blue screen that meant a heart had decided to stop working. Elena was already moving before the announcement came through. Chen's room. The lung she'd been worried about had finally collapsed. The night shift at Sacred Heart moved at the pace of controlled grief. 28 hours since the John Doe, since Chen, had arrived in the ER with nothing but a Ranger tab tattoo and a faded unit patch that Elena kept seeing behind her eyes, even when she closed them. The hospital had shifted into that particular darkness that came after midnight, when the fluorescent light seemed to hum just slightly out of phase with human consciousness, and the only movement was the rubber-soled shuffle of nurses between rooms. Elena pushed the medication cart toward Trauma Bay 3, her movements economical and precise. The reassignment to nights had been framed as scheduling optimization, but they both knew it was banishment. Day shift was where the action was, where the learning happened, where the career progressed. Nights was where they put nurses they wanted out of sight. Still, she'd volunteered to check Chen's vitals every 2 hours. Not asked. Volunteered. It was a small distinction, but Ashford had noticed. His voice had been careful when he'd clarified the boundaries. Elena, Captain Chen is stable. His care is straightforward. You're on medication distribution and general floor coverage. Report anything concerning to me directly. Do not attempt independent assessment. Not * report to the attending physician *. Report to * him *. Elena understood protocols. She understood chains of command. She also understood when a chain was being weaponized. At 2:16 a.m., she entered Chen's room for the second time that shift. The monitors displayed his vitals with the casual reassurance of machines that hadn't yet learned to be worried. Oxygen saturation 94%. Heart rate 72. Blood pressure stable. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm, each breath a small victory against the sepsis that had taken root in his lungs during those hours he'd spent unconscious in an alley, breathing San Diego's contaminated air. Elena placed her hand on his forehead, the way she had when her own son was small and fevered. Chen's skin was warm, not hot. Still fighting. She moved to the left side of his chest and placed her stethoscope against his ribs, listening past the ventilator noise for the sounds that mattered. Breath sounds on the right side were clear, that familiar rushing whisper of air finding its way down through the bronchial tree. She shifted the stethoscope to the left side. Diminished. Significantly. In 4 hours, the left lung had gone from equal breath sounds to barely audible. Like the difference between a full glass of water pouring and a glass running dry. Elena's hand stayed steady as she documented the finding. The chart reflected the decline in clear, clinical language, left-sided diminished breath sounds, basilar region. Unable to auscultate adequate air movement despite ventilator settings unchanged. Recommend attending evaluation for possible pneumothorax. She walked to the nurse's station at 3:15 a.m. and found Dr. Morrison, the night attending, reviewing labs on the computer. Morrison was competent, 43 years old, 15 years of ER experience, the kind of doctor who listened to nurses because he understood that nurses spent more continuous time with patients than anyone else in the hospital. Dr. Morrison, I need to flag something on Chen in Trauma 3. Breath sounds on the left are significantly diminished from my assessment 4 hours ago. Pattern suggests possible developing pneumothorax. Morrison didn't hesitate. He stood immediately, reaching for his stethoscope. Elena felt the small release of tension in her chest. This was how it was supposed to work. This was protocol. This was safe. They were footsteps toward the room when Dr. Ashford emerged from the break room, a coffee cup in his hand that looked like a prop in a stage play about authority. He didn't move fast, didn't raise his voice. He simply existed in the space between Morrison and the patient room with the casual certainty of someone who'd already arranged the outcome. Morrison. I've got this patient. I'll reassess. Not a request. Not even technically a usurpation of authority, Ashford was the senior physician on night shift, and hospital protocol allowed him to assume oversight of any case. Elena watched Morrison's shoulders drop slightly as he accepted the reality of it. He's concerned about possible pneumothorax, Elena said quietly. Left-sided breath sounds decreased significantly. Ashford's expression didn't change. Elena, I appreciate your diligence, but Captain Chen was stable when I rounded 2 hours ago. I'll check him myself and contact you if I need anything. You have other patients to monitor. It wasn't until she was back at the medication cart that Elena realized her jaw was clenched so tightly she could feel her molars grinding. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint, the kind that came from knowing exactly what was happening and being unable to stop it. At 4:22 a.m., her phone buzzed in her pocket. Hospital phones weren't allowed for personal calls, but her shift was technically a break, and she'd stepped into the stairwell where the signal was better. The number on the screen was her son's military-issued cell, which meant official business for him, which meant he was calling from somewhere that allowed only brief conversations. Hey, Mom. His voice sounded older than it had 3 months ago. That was what Bagram did. It aged people in fast forward. I'm trying to get an update on Captain Chen. Is he stable? Elena sat down on the concrete step, her scrubs making a soft whispering sound against the rough surface. Yes. He's stable. Sedated, on mechanical ventilation, but his vital signs are tracking well. Good. A pause. She could hear wind in the background, that particular desert wind that carried the sound of 1,000 problems unsolved. I know you've been taking care of him. I heard from one of the guys that you're the one who got him stabilized in the ER. I wanted to thank you for. Your commanding officer has adjusted my care assignments. Elena chose each word like she was diffusing a device. I'm on the night shift now. Dr. Ashford is overseeing the captain's care directly. He's competent. Another pause. Longer this time. When her son spoke again, his voice had changed, dropped into something that sounded like the command tone he was still learning to use. Mom, what happened? Nothing happened. That's hospital work. Assignments change. You recognize him, didn't you? That's why you. I need to get back to my shift. Elena stood, and the motion felt like standing against gravity. The captain is stable. That's what matters. She hung up before he could respond, before she could hear the disappointment in his voice, before she could explain something she didn't have the words to defend. The stairwell smelled like old concrete and the kind of chemical cleaner they used in hospitals, the kind that burned your throat if you stood still long enough to really breathe it in. At 5:15 a.m., Elena was back at the medication cart when she felt it, that particular sensation that every nurse learned to recognize, the one that came before anything was visibly wrong. It was a disturbance in the ambient pressure of a room, the way a dog knows a storm is coming before the clouds appear. She made her way toward Chen's room, not hurrying, not drawing attention. Through the window, she could see the ventilator's numbers. Oxygen saturation 92%. That was a drop from the 94 she documented an hour ago. Dropping steadily. Like watching a timer count down and no one else in the building knew the clock was running. The breath sounds, she was certain now, had progressed beyond diminished. The left lung wasn't moving air anymore. It was collapsed or collapsing, and with a pneumothorax came pressure, a one-way valve of air accumulating in the pleural space, compressing the lung, pushing the trachea, building toward the moment when the heart would have nowhere to beat. Elena went to the equipment room and began pulling supplies. 14-gauge angiocath needle. Sterile drapes. The blue emergency kit that contained everything for needle decompression. She didn't hide it. She didn't try to be subtle. If Ashford wanted to stop her, he would have to physically prevent her from trying to save the life of a ranger who'd spent 2 tours breathing the dust of Bagram so his country could sleep at night. She pulled her personal phone from her locker, the one with the photo still glowing on the screen, the faded unit patch from inside Chen's jacket, the proof that she'd known who he was all along. She opened her email and began typing a summary of her observations, time-stamped and documented, sending copies to 3 addresses, the hospital's chief medical officer, the ethics committee, and the nursing director. If Ashford was going to prevent her from reporting, then she would report preemptively. It was 5:11 a.m. when the alarm finally sounded. Not the gentle escalation of a declining vital sign. The sharp, urgent shriek of a sudden decompensation. Oxygen saturation 78% and dropping. Heart rate climbing. Blood pressure falling. Elena was moving before the code team was even paged, her muscle memory taking over from the moment her brain recognized the pattern. Tension pneumothorax. The kind of crisis that killed people in minutes if no one understood what was happening. She reached Chen's room, and the attending, Morrison, who'd rotated back for this shift, was already there, fumbling with the equipment, his hands moving without purpose. Tension pneumothorax, left side, Elena said, her voice steady as a laser. Tracheal deviation. Distended neck veins. He needs needle decompression now. Ashford stood in the doorway, watching. His phone was already in his hand. Not calling for help. Calling. Elena moved toward the crash cart, her movements precise and economical. The MRE packages she'd noticed in Chen's belongings bag, the carefully preserved vacuum-sealed meal that had traveled with him like a talisman, were sitting on the counter where they'd been catalogued with his personal effects. She grabbed one, felt the weight of it, and in one sharp motion tore open the corner. The plastic wrapper came free from the meal inside. She had 5 seconds, maybe less, before Ashford realized what she was doing. Morrison had the needle now, 14 gauge, and Elena was already positioning the wrapper over the insertion point, creating a makeshift one-way valve with a kind of field-craft efficiency that only came from training. The needle went in. The hiss of air escaping. O2 climbing. 78. 82. 88. The lung beginning to re-expand, the pressure releasing, the life returning to the numbers on the monitor. 90%. Stable. The entire sequence took for minutes and 11 seconds. When it was over, Chen's heart was beating on its own again, his oxygen saturation holding steady, his chest rising and falling in synchrony with the mechanical breath of the ventilator. Morrison was staring at Elena with an expression that sat somewhere between gratitude and the terrible weight of understanding what she'd just done. "Where did you learn that technique?" he asked quietly. Elena said nothing. She was already moving to the medication drawer to prepare the sedation that would keep Chen stable, to document the intervention with clinical precision, to become invisible again. It took Ashford 47 seconds to leave the doorway. She watched him go to the nurse's station and make 3 phone calls, each lasting exactly 1 minute and 30 seconds. To the nursing director. To hospital administration. To someone else, a friend, a colleague, someone with authority and a long memory. Each conversation ended with Elena's name. At 6:16 a.m., security appeared at the nurse's station. 2 of them, in the kind of uniforms that were designed to project authority without actual threat, which somehow made them more frightening. The lead officer placed Elena's badge on the desk in front of her, and she understood without being told. "We need that badge. You've been suspended pending investigation into unauthorized medical intervention and patient endangerment." Elena looked at the badge, her badge, the one that identified her as part of this place, part of this mission, and felt something inside her become very still. Not sadness. Not anger. Just the profound quiet that came when you realized the decision had already been made in rooms you weren't allowed to enter. She picked up the badge and placed it in the officer's palm. Her hands were absolutely steady. Her eyes were absolutely dry. She was a nurse, a professional, a woman who understood that the system had rules and consequences, and that sometimes people like her didn't get to choose which ones applied. "I'd like to check on Captain Chen one more time before I leave. You're not authorized near that patient. We've been told you may be a threat." The word sat in the air between them like something obscene. Elena turned and walked toward the exit, and no one followed her, no one called her back, no one stood up at the nursing station and said, "That's wrong. That's absolutely wrong." The parking garage was empty at 6:13 a.m., the kind of empty that swallowed sound and made you feel like you were walking through a photograph of a place instead of the place itself. Elena sat in her car without starting the engine. The photo on her phone screen still glowed, the unit patch, the evidence of her recognition, the moment she'd decided that honor mattered more than self-preservation. She didn't know, sitting there in the silence of her car with the keys in her hand and her hands shaking not from fear but from the kind of restraint that had kept her alive through 2 tours of Bagram, that in exactly 21 hours and 13 minutes, the sky above Sacred Heart Hospital would fill with the sound of rotor blades. She didn't know that a Ranger colonel was already calling his commanders, reading reports, understanding what had happened in that emergency room. She didn't know that a Navy SEAL had seen the same unit patch photograph and made a phone call to someone who could make phone calls to people who actually held power. She only knew that the car engine wouldn't start, her hands had finally begun to shake, and the faded image of a unit patch on her phone screen was the only proof that anything true had ever happened at all. At 36 hours, the alarm started as a whisper. Then it screamed. Elena was at the medication cart on the 4th floor when the monitor above Chen's bed began its escalating wail, a sound like a siren trapped inside a metal box. She didn't run. Running made you miss details. She walked. Fast. Her eyes were already calculating before she crossed the threshold into his room. Oxygen sat was 94 when she'd checked it 14 minutes ago. The monitor read 78 and dropping. His left lung was collapsing in real time. The attending, Dr. Morrison, stood frozen in the doorway, phone halfway to his ear. The respiratory tech hadn't arrived yet. The crash cart was still 3 rooms down. The code team was being paged, but they were scattered, someone in the cafeteria, someone on the 3rd floor, someone still 7 minutes away. Elena was already moving. Her hands found the oxygen mask, verified the seal, confirmed the ventilator was delivering 100%. The numbers told the story: plummeting oxygen, rising CO2, chest wall barely moving on the left side. Pneumothorax. Tension pneumothorax. Air in the pleural space collapsing the lung, pushing the mediastinum, compressing the heart. He had maybe 4 minutes before his blood pressure bottomed and cardiac arrest followed. She grabbed Chen's chart. Left-sided breath sounds diminished since hour 28. The report she'd written, that Ashford had buried, was playing out in real time on the monitor. She'd been right. That wasn't comforting. "Get me a 14-gauge angiocath and a one-way valve," Elena said to Morrison. Not a request. A command. The attending blinked, then moved. Elena turned to Chen's belongings on the chair, the jacket, the duffel bag, the personal items from a combat zone. She tore open the MRE package, beef stew in brownie sauce, meal ready to eat, standard issue, something she'd carried through minefields and mortar attacks. She knew exactly what this packaging could do. The clear plastic wrapper made a crisp tearing sound. One-way valve. Air could escape. Blood couldn't flood back. Field medicine from 100 combat hospitals where there was no equipment, only training and improvisation, and the absolute refusal to watch someone die while resources existed within arm's reach. Morrison returned with the needle. Elena's hands moved on their own, muscle memory transcending 6 years of civilian hospital work. Second intercostal space, midclavicular line. The anatomical landmark was the same whether you were under fire in Helmand Province or in a sterile trauma bay in San Diego. The needle advanced through skin, through fascia, through the pleural space. The hiss came, compressed air escaping like a breath held for hours finally released. Immediate. Violent. The sound of a tension pneumothorax decompressing. She secured the MRE wrapper with tape. Not pretty. Perfect. The monitor shifted. Oxygen sat started climbing. 79, 82. 85, Chen's blood pressure, which had been dropping toward oblivion, stabilized. The attending stood motionless, watching her work, understanding now that he'd been watching a master class in trauma medicine conducted by a person he'd dismissed as just a nurse. Elena checked the bilateral breath sounds. Left side now faintly audible. Not recovered, but no longer collapsing. Not perfect, but alive. She looked at Morrison. Get radiology. Chest X-ray now. Prepare for formal tube thoracostomy once we confirm the second pneumothorax isn't progressing. She paused. He's stable for the next hour. Morrison nodded. He didn't speak. The room had entered a different atmosphere, one where expertise had created an invisible barrier between Elena and everyone else in it. That's when Elena felt him in the doorway. Dr. Ashford stood with his hands at his sides, his expression unreadable. He'd seen the entire intervention. Watched Elena tear open an MRE package. Watched her perform a procedure that wasn't in a hospital's protocol, wasn't on any authorization form, wasn't anything except exactly what kept Captain Derek Chen alive when conventional medicine was still 50 yards away. Ashford's jaw tightened. His eyes narrowed. And in that moment, Elena saw something shift behind his pupils, not anger, but calculation. The kind of thinking that happens when a threat you've underestimated suddenly reveals its full magnitude. He turned and walked back down the hallway. Elena didn't watch him go. She was already charting the intervention, noting the time, documenting the clinical decision. Morrison was on the phone with radiology. A code team member arrived too late to help and immediately began setting up for proper chest decompression. The room moved forward into the next phase of trauma care. At hour 40, Elena's phone rang. It wasn't security. It wasn't the charge nurse. It was the hospital operator transferring 3 separate calls that came through the main line within 15 minutes of each other. The first was from the nursing director's office. She didn't answer. The message waited in her inbox. Ms. Martinez, we need to discuss your conduct during the incident in 4 ICU. Please come to my office immediately upon your shift ending. The second was from hospital administration. Another message. We've received a report regarding unauthorized medical procedures and patient care decisions outside your scope of practice. Do not perform any additional patient care pending investigation. The third message was from someone named Dr. Patricia Chen at the State Board of Nursing Credentialing. The voicemail was clinical, professional, devastating. Ms. Martinez, we've received a complaint filed by Dr. Ashford regarding scope of practice violations. Your license is under preliminary review. Elena stood in the hallway outside Chen's room, reading these messages while his chest rise and fall confirmed that he was breathing. His monitor showed a sinus rhythm. His oxygen sat was 88 and holding. She'd saved his life using field medicine from a combat zone. And Dr. Ashford had used those 3 minutes of her expertise to build a case against her. The calculation had been instantaneous. He'd witnessed her skill, overwhelming, undeniable, visible to everyone in that room. And instead of admiring it, he'd seen a threat. A nurse who knew more than the attending physicians. A nurse who could override protocol and be correct. A nurse who had revealed, in 60 seconds of crisis response, exactly how competent and dangerous she actually was. So he'd made his calls. One to the nursing director. She performed an emergency procedure without authorization. It worked, which is the only reason she isn't facing immediate termination. But this kind of independent decision-making is a liability. One to hospital administration. The patient survived, but only because she took it upon herself to initiate care outside her scope. What happens when she's wrong? What happens when she injures someone? We need protection. One to his friend on the credentialing board, Elena Martinez. Scope of practice violation. She's a flight risk and a risk to patients. We need preliminary suspension while we investigate. The words were calculated. The threat was real. The strategy was perfect. Because Ashford had understood something in that moment, you don't destroy someone's competence by attacking their competence. You attack their credentials. You question their judgment. You make people wonder if the person who just saved a life had actually violated protocol so severely that she endangered everyone else. Elena walked out of the ICU at 2:13 a.m. She passed the nursing station where the charge nurse she'd trained 10 years ago was reviewing charts. The woman looked up, saw Elena, and immediately looked back down at her papers. She passed Chen's room one final time. The monitor showed stable vitals. Her improvised chest seal was still in place, still working, still keeping him alive. She passed the break room where the 3 nurses sat with their coffee. None of them looked up when her footsteps passed the doorway. A hospital security guard appeared at the elevators. "Ms. Martinez? Dr. Ashford requested we escort you from the building." She didn't argue. There was no point in arguing. Protocol existed to protect institutions from liability, and right now, she was the liability. The parking garage was empty. Fluorescent lights cast everything in the color of a crime scene. Her car was where she'd left it 12 hours ago. She got in. Saturday. Closed the door on the silence. The key turned in the ignition. The engine clicked. Dead battery. She tried again. Nothing. Again. The starter motor made a grinding sound like something trying to die. Her hand started shaking. Not the small tremor of a stressful shift. Not the controlled breathing of someone processing a difficult moment. The full-body tremor of adrenaline that had been running for 60 seconds of crisis response and was finally, now that the danger was past, releasing all at once. Her left leg throbbed where the shrapnel had entered. 23 years since Bagram. She could still feel the moment the mortar round hit the field hospital, the sensation of hot metal tearing through muscle and bone, the absolute clarity of understanding that you were about to die in a place where the sky was the color of rust and death came in fragments. She'd survived that. Held 17 people together while the world was on fire. Carried 2 wounded through a minefield when the medevac couldn't land because the landing zone was actively under fire. And she'd been suspended for saving a life with an MRE package. Her phone lit up with a message from hospital HR at 3:14 a.m. Formal investigation initiated. Do not contact staff or patients. Do not return to facility. She stared at the message until the screen went dark. At 4:41 a.m., her phone rang. Her son's voice, frantic, "Mom, why didn't you tell me Chen was there? I just got the message. Where are you? Your shift ended hours ago. Why aren't you home?" She tried to speak. Her throat had closed. She tried again. Nothing came out except the sound of breathing. "Mom? Mom, where are you?" Parking garage, she finally managed. Car won't start. At 4:52 a.m., she heard footsteps. Her son appeared at the driver's window with jumper cables, his face moving from concern to something else when he saw her hands gripping the steering wheel. "Mom. Mom, look at me." She lifted her head. He stopped talking. 47 seconds later, the sound started. Distant at first. A rhythmic thumping that echoed through the concrete structure. Getting louder. The rotor wash of a helicopter that was close enough now that the sound bounced off the parking garage walls like it was trapped inside the very foundation of the building. At exactly hour 48, the Black Hawks landed in Sacred Heart's parking lot. Elena's hands wouldn't stop shaking. Not from fear. From restraint. She sat in her parked car in the Sacred Heart garage, the steering wheel still cold under her palms, the engine refusing to turn over the way her mind refused to process what had just happened. The photo of the unit patch glowed on her phone screen, that faded square of fabric, the only proof that she'd recognized something true, something real, something that mattered. Outside the garage, rain hammered the concrete like applause that nobody wanted to hear. 48 hours earlier, she'd walked into this hospital as Major Elena Martinez, though nobody knew it. 48 hours later, she'd walked out as a terminated employee, a suspended nurse, a woman security had escorted past her colleagues with orders not to look back. The fluorescent lights of the hallway had buzzed overhead during that walk, a sound like electricity trying to escape. 3 nurses she'd worked with for 8 years had turned away when she passed. One of them, Sarah, who Elena had trained on arterial blood gas extraction, had actually stepped backward, as if proximity to Elena's suspension might be contagious. That's when Elena understood, Dr. Ashford hadn't just fired her. He'd systematized her erasure. He'd made her untouchable. The moment her shift started at 6 in the morning, she'd arrived to find her badge surrendered. Not a conversation. Not a letter. Just a security officer waiting at the employee entrance, his expression neutral the way people looked at expired documents. Badge stays here, Ms. Martinez. You're on unpaid suspension pending investigation. She'd asked for Chen. Security had looked uncomfortable. Doctor's orders. You're not cleared for patient access. The words had landed like shrapnel, precise, calculated, designed to wound without leaving marks. She'd turned to leave and seen 3 staff members watching from behind the triage desk. One of them whispered something. The others nodded. By noon, the whispers had crystallized into narrative. Elena heard fragments as she walked through the ER one final time, trying to reach Chen's room before security forcibly removed her, unstable, patient stalker, emotional compromise, boundary violation. The words hung in the air like contamination. A resident she'd worked with dozens of times, a woman Elena had mentored through a difficult NICU rotation, had actually crossed to the opposite side of the hallway when Elena approached. Not out of anger. Out of fear. Ashford had poisoned the well so completely that association with Elena had become liability. He'd done it without raising his voice, without a single outburst, just 3 phone calls and a pattern of whispered suggestions. That was the difference between a fool and a strategist. Ashford was a strategist. She'd made one final attempt at Chen's room around 1400 hours. The security guard stationed outside, a young man named Rodriguez whom Elena had helped with a panic attack in the break room 6 months ago, had actually looked pained when she approached. "I can't let you in, Major." He'd used her rank reflexively, and for a moment his eyes had flickered with recognition of something deeper than suspension notices. But his supervisor was watching from down the hall, and the moment fractured. Doctor's orders. You understand. She'd understood perfectly. Ashford had ensured she couldn't even confirm Chen was recovering, couldn't witness the consequence of her own hand saving his life. The isolation was surgical. Precise. The walkout had been the worst part. Not because of the humiliation, she'd trained her entire body to absorb humiliation without flinching, but because of the silence. The ER staff had parted like she was radioactive, their eyes carefully averted, the hallway suddenly empty except for her and Rodriguez escorting her toward the exit. Elena's footsteps had echoed on the tile, each step a countdown to erasure. She'd caught her reflection in the glass doors at the exit and barely recognized herself. The same woman who'd held 17 lives together in a trauma bay under fire was now being treated like a threat to the institution she'd just saved. The rotor wash of the Black Hawks that would arrive at hour 48 was already stirring somewhere on the horizon, though she had no way of knowing it yet. Now, in the parking garage, her hands gripped the steering wheel so hard her knuckles had gone white. The trembling wasn't fear. She'd faced actual terror, the kind that came with incoming fire, with patient coding, with decisions that meant the difference between someone's child coming home or not. This was different. This was the weight of restraint. She'd spent 2 decades learning not to break, and in 48 hours, a man with a medical degree and a grudge had dismantled every professional achievement she'd constructed, had made her own colleagues afraid to acknowledge her existence, had turned her act of life-saving into evidence of pathology. The phone screen still showed the unit patch. She stared at it. That tiny square of fabric, faded from sun and sweat, sewn into the lining of Chen's jacket with stitches that somebody, probably Chen himself on some distant afternoon in a barracks, had made by hand. She'd recognized it. She'd known what it meant. She'd documented it. And for that act of witnessing, she'd been systematically destroyed. The engine wouldn't turn over. She tried again. And again. The battery was fine, the gas tank full, but the car seemed to understand that Elena wasn't ready to go home yet. Wasn't ready to face the apartment where no one would call, no one would text, where her son would eventually find out his commanding officer's recovery had been jeopardized because Elena had shown up on his shift. She'd been suspended. She'd been isolated. She'd been made untouchable. The only thing left was to sit in the dark garage and wait for whatever came next. Then, at exactly 48 hours from the moment Chen's lung had collapsed and Elena's hands had moved with the muscle memory of 1,000 emergencies, 2 helicopters appeared over San Diego. Black Hawks, their rotors cutting the air like they were slicing time itself in half. The sound rolled across the city, a percussion that made every window in Sacred Heart rattle. Elena didn't know it was coming for her. She just sat in her car with her hand shaking and the unit patch photo glowing on her screen, unaware that the military had finally decided to arrive. The first helicopter touched down in a parking lot at exactly 1600 hours. The second followed 3 minutes later, its rotor wash sending debris and rain across the asphalt in spiraling walls. A Ranger Colonel emerged from the first Black Hawk, tall, shoulders that carried the weight of decisions, eyes that had seen command decisions ripple across continents. He strode through the ER doors with a presence that made the air pressure change, the kind of authority that didn't need to announce itself because it was already filling the room. When he reached the trauma desk, his voice cut through the afternoon hum like a blade. "I'm looking for Major Elena Martinez. Bring her to me now." Elena didn't know this was happening. She was still in the garage, hands shaking, phone screen glowing with proof. The nursing director found her 10 minutes later, breathless, having run from the ER. "Elena, you need to come with me. Right now." Elena looked up, confused. "I'm suspended." "That's being corrected," the director said. "Come on." When Elena walked back into Sacred Heart, she understood nothing except that something had broken open. The staff who'd avoided her that morning were now watching with different eyes, not fear this time, but something closer to shock. The Ranger Colonel stood in the center of the ER, and beside him stood Lieutenant Daniel Martinez in civilian clothes, Elena's son, his jaw tight with something between fury and satisfaction. The Colonel's eyes found Elena the moment she entered the room. "Major Martinez." It wasn't a question. The entire ER went silent. The fluorescent light seemed to dim. Elena's voice, when it came, was quiet but clear. "Sir." The Colonel opened a folder. His hands trembled as he read, not from fear, but from controlled emotion barely contained. "Major Elena Martinez. Distinguished Service Cross. 2 tours, Bagram. Medically discharged after taking shrapnel to preserve field hospital integrity, saving 37 personnel." He paused. "That wasn't in Captain Chen's admission records. Wasn't in your employment file. Wasn't something Dr. Ashford knew when he decided to suspend you for recognizing a patient's military affiliation." Elena said nothing. Her son stepped forward. "Mom saved Captain Chen's life when the hospital couldn't. Dr. Ashford made 3 phone calls to have her credentialing flagged while she was performing an emergency procedure." Daniel's voice was steady, military trained. "I watched her do this work under fire. I watched her make decisions that meant people came home." A Navy SEAL commander emerged from behind the Colonel, Lieutenant Commander Graves, call sign Breaker, someone who'd worked joint operations with Elena's unit at Bagram. His voice was matter-of-fact, the way warriors spoke about other warriors. "She held a trauma bay alone. For hours under sustained fire. No backup. No reinforcements. 17 lives. She had shrapnel in her abdomen the last hour and a half. Kept working. Kept those people alive." He looked at Elena. 3 Purple Hearts. Silver Star. She never filed the paperwork on the 3rd one. Dr. Ashford stood frozen at the nurse's station. His face had gone the color of old gauze. The CEO stood beside him, her expression shifting from confusion to understanding to something that looked like anger. Ashford's strategic advantage had evaporated in the time it took for 2 Black Hawks to land. That evening, Ashford appeared on the local news. Elena watched from Chen's recovery room, where her son sat reading beside the captain's bed, where Chen was breathing on his own again, where the unit patch now hung framed on the wall next to flowers someone had sent with a card that read, "Welcome home, sir." Ashford was still wearing the white coat, still projecting the authority of medicine and institutional power. "While we certainly respect Major Martinez's service," he said carefully, his voice smooth and practiced, "patient care requires objective clinical judgment. My suspension decision was based on established protocol." The anchor nodded sympathetically. Then the producer interrupted. "Doctor, we have a caller on the line." Colonel Patterson, Fort Benning. The Ranger Colonel's voice came through the television speaker, and the entire room seemed to contract. I'm listening to a man defend obstructing care for a Ranger captain because that man didn't recognize the Ranger patch that Major Martinez did. Dr. Ashford didn't suspend her for protocol. He punished her for competence. For witnessing. For being the only person in that emergency room who understood what she was looking at. Ashford's face flushed red. He opened his mouth. Major Martinez held that trauma bay together with an MRE wrapper because your ER wasn't prepared, the colonel continued. 3 phone calls. That's what it took to suspend her. 3 calls to have a Distinguished Service Cross recipient flagged as unstable. 17 million people are watching this, Doctor. How many of them know that you called a decorated officer a liability? The screen cut to commercial. Within 20 minutes, the clip had 8 million views. Ashford's face was trending. The hospital's board convened an emergency session at 1800 hours. By 2200, his medical license was flagged pending investigation. By midnight, the hospital issued a statement, Dr. Marcus Ashford has been terminated, effective immediately. 2 months later, Elena walked through Sacred Heart's ER in a new uniform. Chief Nursing Officer. The badge gleamed on her scrubs, a promotion that had come with an apology letter from the CEO, with a sealed settlement, with a system-wide review of military patient identification protocols that Elena had personally written and implemented. She stopped at Chen's recovery room. He was sitting up now, physical therapy equipment arranged beside his bed, Elena's son in civilian clothes reading the sports section like nothing had changed. Chen's eyes found her and he struggled to stand. Major, I heard what happened. What you went through. Elena smiled. You're healing. That's what matters. She glanced out the hospital window. Across the parking lot, in the strip mall where insurance offices clustered like organisms, Dr. Ashford sat beneath a faded banner at a folding table. No white coat. No institutional authority. Just a man in a polo shirt talking to a distracted couple about life insurance policies nobody wanted. His medical license was suspended. His career was systematically dismantled, not by Elena, but by the consequences of his own actions, by the decision to punch down at the wrong person, by the failure to recognize what was standing in front of him. Elena watched for 5 seconds. Then she turned back to Chen and Daniel. Was it worth it? Her son asked. Everything you went through. Elena touched the unit patch, now framed and hung on Chen's wall beside recovery flowers. Every single second. She stood. Her limp was barely noticeable now that she wasn't working 60-hour shifts. Her hands no longer trembled. The restraint that had held her together through suspension and humiliation had transformed into something else, authority that didn't need to announce itself, presence that made people listen, the kind of power that came from having survived the worst and emerged still willing to help. You changed the whole system, Daniel said, gesturing to the news playing silently on the room TV, a segment about improving military medical identification protocols, featuring Elena's interview, her voice clear and measured as she explained how to recognize service markers, how to preserve dignity, how to understand that the quietest person in the room might be carrying the heaviest burden. Elena shook her head. I just recognized a tattoo. Mom. You took on a hospital director and won. Elena looked at both of them, then out the window at Ashford's table in the distance, where a former colleague walked past without acknowledging him. She straightened her new badge and stood. Power isn't a title. Power is the ability to help. She walked out to her first day leading the department. The nurses at the station stood when she approached, not to leave, but in respect. The ER felt different already. Clearer. Safer. Built on the principle that people mattered, that recognition mattered, that the invisible sacrifices deserved to be seen. If you made it this far, you know what it takes to stand firm when everyone else is running. Subscribe for more stories of people whose true identity changes everything. Like this video if you believe that heroes deserve recognition. And comment, have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your real value?